thanks for coming. And thanks so much.
My first question is, because we're not a lot of people, are there people who have been following what's been going on in Montreal or in Quebec in general? Okay, a little bit. So I grew up in Buffalo, New York, but I moved to Montreal 6 years ago. So I've been living in Montreal for about 6 years, and when I first moved there, I got involved in the student movement through the school that I was going to. But I finished school 3 years ago and stayed. So I've been participating in the student strike that's been happening this time around as someone who isn't from the university. So keep that in mind. And also that I'm not from Quebec. So I'm going to try and do a bunch of history stuff, but if you have questions at the end, I might not know them because I didn't major in history. I don't know a lot about Quebec history.
I heard something about the students were dissatisfied out there. They didn't like something.
Yeah.
What was that? We'll get to that?
Yeah, I'll get to that.
I can wait.
Yeah. So I wanted to do a bit of a history because I think the reason why the student strike happened in Quebec is because of the history of the way university students have organized themselves. And I'm going to start the timeline in the 60s, although probably could have started earlier than that too. So the Quebec student unions at the schools took a lot of inspiration from French student unions. So when the French students were reorganizing themselves in the 60s and starting to form general assemblies and making decisions on a more faculty-based level instead of having hierarchical student unions where the president would decide things for the students, they started organizing themselves on more of a non-hierarchical level to make decisions in that way. So the Quebec students borrowed that. So the way the Quebec student unions work is that they function a lot like workers' unions. So they have general assemblies that decide day-to-day functioning kind of things in a way. One of the main things they decide is whether or not to go on strike. They decide on actions to take in response to different government policies that are getting passed. They have general assemblies that happen once a week during a strike, and a lot of schools are re-voting week to week on whether or not to stay on strike, and that's something that's been happening since the 60s. So the first student strike that ever happened in Quebec happened in 1968. It led to the creation of the University of Quebec system, which was modeled after the University of California system. At the time, Francophone students in the province didn't have a lot of options in terms, so I'm going to use two terms a lot. Anglophone refers to people who speak English as their first language, and Francophone refers to people who speak French as their first language. So Francophone students prior to 1968 had just received, there had just been massive changes to the education system in Quebec. And so at the time you graduate, this still works this way, you graduate from high school at age 16, you go to something called Cégep for 3 years. It's kind of like community college, but it's free, and you just have to pay for your books and your rent and things like that. But once they opened the Cégep system, they didn't have enough universities to let in all these students who were going to Cégep and then wanted to go to university. They only had elite, mostly Anglophone, Catholic-run universities. So students went on strike in the Cégep system in 1968, and that led to the creation of the University of Quebec system, which is modeled after the University of California system. And one thing to keep in mind about these unions is that one of their main tenets is something called syndicalisme de combat, which means combative unionism, basically. So they believe that taking direct action towards their ends, whatever they decide they are, in terms of resisting tuition fees mostly, is at the center of their student organizing. So they're really into mobilizing, they're really into getting a lot of people out into the streets, and they're really into going on strike. They've gone on strike, I think about 8 times since 1968, and mostly it's been against tuition fees. I know once in the 70s they went on strike against aptitude tests, which were being used to stop Francophones from being able to go to school. And in 1983 they went on strike in solidarity with the general strike in the city that was happening, so in solidarity with a lot of workers who were on strike. And since then, it's mostly been about tuition fees. In 1996, tuition was frozen in Quebec, and that freeze was on for almost 10 years. And then the last big strike that happened before the most recent one was in 2005. And there's a few things about that strike that I'm going to talk about, and then I'll move into the most recent strike in 2012. So in 2005, there were, and there still are, 3 main student federations. So the way these are organized, you have your faculty, and your faculty gets together and has a general assembly and decides things amongst themselves, and then you have the bigger universities deciding to associate themselves with student federations. So the 3 federations are AC, FERC, and FEC, and one of them is for the Cégeps, one of them, AC is the more left one, and FEC is the Cégep one, I believe. I don't know what all the acronyms stand for. So in 2005 they went on strike for 7 weeks. It was against the change from bursaries to loans, of a bunch of money from bursaries to loans, so essentially people would have to be paying back money that they wouldn't have had to pay back before. So they went on strike for 7 weeks, and what ended up happening is that the government told ASE that they weren't allowed into the negotiations. So this is the further left union being shut out of the negotiations. The two more moderate unions are in the negotiations. They accept a deal, which ASE says it would never have accepted. So they get $103 million turned back from loans into bursaries, but they lose something like 200 or 300 million from the years before that had been bursaries and loans that had been switched into loans. So some people saw that as a bit of a victory, but other people saw that as a way that Quebec had collaborated with the government and shut ASE out of the negotiations. So that's something to keep in mind because it had an impact in terms of how things have been playing out in 2012. One thing to keep in mind is that tuition at the time, in 2007, tuition in Quebec to go to university was $1,600 a year. And the reason why it's so low is because they've been going on strike every time it raises since the 60s. But one of the big arguments that people have used against the strike is, oh, you guys have the lowest tuition in Canada, you have a huge gap in terms of tuition between the US and Quebec. But the reason why they've been able to do it, I think, is because they've been going on strike. So from 2007 to 2012, tuition raised from $1,600 to $2,100. And when I was in school in 2007, a bunch of student unions tried to go on strike, but failed to get enough student unions to vote to go on strike in order to have a general strike. So that failed and the tuition increased. And then in 2011, it was announced that it would increase again from $2,100 to $4,000 in 5 years. And so that's where we're at in terms of the strikes starting for this year. So in March 2011, the hike was announced, and then people immediately started organizing for a strike. And one of the ways that happens is that the ASE creates a temporary union for the duration of the strike. And that ended up getting created in October 2011, I believe, and so they call themselves the Class. So if you've been reading anything in the news about this, the main union that people have been talking about is called Class. So on November 10th, 2011, there was a 20,000 person demo that happened in Montreal. It ended with the paint bombing of Jean Charest's office. Now Jean Charest is the equivalent to the governor of Quebec. He's called the premier. So he's the main person in office, the main politician that people are directing all their anger at during this strike. So someone paint bombed his office, and then there was an occupation of the principal's office at McGill, which is the elite Anglophone university in town. And that was pretty unheard of in terms of students at McGill doing something at their own school in solidarity with Francophone students. Riot cops went on the McGill campus. There was a whole situation that happened where I think 2 or 3 people got arrested, and there was a lot of outcry at McGill in terms of having riot cops on their campus. People hadn't seen that happen before. They were using pepper spray against people like right outside the doors of the administration office where the occupation was happening. So people were pretty angry about that, and I think that created something that ended up being a first for this strike, where you see Anglophone schools going on strike. And that had never happened in the history of Quebec. Usually it's just Francophone schools that go on strike. But this time around, there were a bunch of students at one of the Anglophone schools called Concordia that went on strike, and then a bunch of students at McGill who ended up going on strike. On the 17th of February, there was the occupation of a cégep called Cégep de Vieux-Montréal. And I'm told that if you decide to go to Cégep de Vieux, you go knowing that you're going to go on strike at least once while you're there. Because that school has a history of being the first school to go on strike, and every time they end up usually in the earlier end of voting to go on strike. They blockade the doors to their schools, they occupy their school until the cops come in, usually at like 2 or 3 in the morning, arrest everyone, usually between like 30 and 60 people, and take them all out of the school. So, yeah.
You said early on that there were 7 or 8 major strikes since 1968 or something like that. Mm-hmm. So is it the ones that you're talking about now, are they within that?
This is 2012. So this is the strike that started.
This would be the 8th or the 9th, something like that?
Yeah, something like that.
Are they happening more frequently?
I don't think they're necessarily happening more frequently. This most recent one is the longest in Quebec history, and it's still not over, so that's something to keep in mind. 2005 was the longest before that, so they're getting longer and longer because I think the government doesn't want to negotiate with the students anymore and doesn't want to allow for the legitimacy of the student unions in terms of negotiating with the government, so that is changing a bit. One of the next things that happened was on February 23rd, the Jacques Cartier Bridge was blocked. So Montreal is an island. Most of the universities and cégeps in the province are on the island, although there are a lot in other cities and small towns throughout the province. And because it's an island, you can only get onto it through a bunch of bridges. So one of the favorite tactics of the student movement, once these students go on strike, is to block the bridges and stop people from getting on or off the island, usually during rush hour when the suburbs are trying to come into the island.
They
So
didn't
the
like
first
it?
time-
They didn't like that?
No, what usually happens is that people try and block the bridge and the riot cops see it coming and block the bridge for them and then try and arrest everyone who's there and then
Was a lot of people arrested?
early on in the strike there weren't that many arrests. There were maybe 35 arrests at the stage of the occupation and then after that things started snowballing. So there's been 2,500 arrests total since February in the whole province, I think. Yeah. And I'll talk a little bit about the police tactics. One of the reasons the numbers are so high is because of the tactics the cops use in Montreal. So the next big thing that happened, and this is where one of the videos comes in, is that on March 8th, there was a big demo in downtown Montreal. At this point, I think almost 300,000 schools, maybe not 300,000 schools. By March 22nd, 316,000 students out of 420,000 in the province were on strike. So we're leading up towards one of the bigger days of the strike. And on March 8th, there's a big demonstration in downtown Montreal, and the cops started using sound grenades. And so I think you guys have all seen these. I think they're called flashbang grenades in the States. And the cops shoot them up over the head of the crowd, and then they explode, they make a really big noise, the ground shakes underneath you. So on March 8th, one of those went off, a piece from it hit a kid in the eye. His name is Francis Grenier, and he lost sight in that eye. Started this like acceleration of confrontational tactics that accelerated for a few days, and then I'll explain in a little bit, sort of died out again. But one of the things that came out of that incident is this music video, which I'll play a little bit of at least. It's like 4.5 minutes long. But it's a band called Mise en Demeure, and they're borrowing from, they're like drawing from Quebecois folk tradition in terms of where the musical style is coming from. But the song itself is about people learning not to be pacifists through demonstrations, through participating in the strike, because they see the brutality that the cops are inflicting on people, no matter what their tactics are. So when the song starts, the chorus is "Nous reste pacifique," which is like we're staying passive, and then as the song continues, the chorus changes a bit. And all of the scenes are scenes from that demo that day in Montreal when Francois Grenier lost his eye. So the song is called "Legitimate Violence, My Eye." And they're saying, "On reste pacifique," we're staying passive. I mean, for that demo, there were a lot of people just sitting in the streets going like this, and the cops are still, you'll see the cops still charge the crowd.
Dans les groupes, dans les programmes sociaux qui demandent aux pauvres de travailler plus pour que les riches payent moins d'impôts. On se stache tous ensemble dans les bureaux de la répo.
Talking about how when they raise taxes for the poor people but not the rich people, they occupy the lot of buildings in Quebec.
Pacifique, oh oui, on reste pacifique. Quand ils nous demandent gentiment de partir, les gars approchent un peu pour pas que la situation empire. Ils nous sifflent à l'oreille un pouce à d'émission. Les policiers courent à l'appel pour faire un job avec passion. Et nous on reste pacifique. Oh oui, on reste pacifique.
So one of the things the cops do in Montreal is to try and get people to move. The riot cops are getting their shields shining rouge, which means move.
Les médias vont prendre des photos, fait qu'on fait des oreilles de lapin. On est rebelles, on est pas prêts. On reste pacifique. Oh oui, on reste pacifique. Vu qu'on fait des signes de piste, ça doit être le cas. On salue, on fait ses défenses citoyennes, citoyennes. Et ils tabassent les militaires, les routes leur gueule ensemble. Et les arrêtent arbitrairement pour faire passer 3 jours en dedans. Et nous on reste pacifique. Oh oui, on reste pacifique. Nous envoient des flashbomb, nous explosent dans le. Nos amis se font péter des manches, c'est comme un humain qui perd.
That's Francois Grenier. And then the chorus
On vient de rien, on reste pacifique, on casse rien, on peut pas trouver l'opinion.
changing. So that one it changed to, we're not bothering anybody, we're staying passive, and yet the cops are still against us. And then it changes the last time to the cops, they stay the fucking cops. And just sort of like, this is one trend that I think a lot of people who started coming out at the beginning of the strike and who are super involved in they're called manifestations, where people were blocking bridges, where people were confronting the cops like almost every single day at this point, start realizing that the cops aren't going to back down, that the government's not listening to them, and it starts changing the way they think about the road. One of the things that happens right after Francois Grenier lost his eye, that's on March 8th, is the annual anti-police brutality demo that happens in Montreal. And it's sort of like an annual riot. Every year it turns into people confronting the cops.
When is that?
It's on March 15th.
Oh.
And every year it turns into the cops mass arresting people. So this is a big tactic that the Montreal cops love to use. They kettle people in, they arrest 300 people all at once, give them all illegal assembly tickets, cuff them all, put them all on city buses and bus them out to processing centers, usually on the edges of the city, and sometimes even on March 15th they'll drive people out to the suburbs and drop them off where there's no bus. So people are kind of used to seeing this happen. It doesn't happen as much this time on March 15th because 4,000 people show up at the demo. At a demo that usually has 350 to 400 people, all of a sudden you have 4,000 people in the streets dispersing, regrouping, the cops couldn't stop what was going on. And someone told me a really exciting story of a bunch of teenagers confronting the cops on horses, and the cops on horses turning and running from them because there were too many teenagers for them. So, on March 20th, the Champlain Bridge was blocked. That's another bridge that lets you onto the island of Montreal. And then on March 22nd, this is the day when 316,000 out of 420,000 students in the province are on strike. Most of those are on unlimited general strike, which means they're voting in their general assemblies to stay on strike week after week after week. Some schools were on a day-long strike in solidarity with the schools that were on unlimited general strike. So on March 22nd, there were 250,000 people in the streets of Montreal marching around in solidarity with the students. And it's the 1 month anniversary of the strike. And that demo brings up one thing that I kind of want to talk about a little bit, which is race and the student movement. I think in a lot of places outside of Quebec, the student movement has been portrayed as a mostly white Quebecois movement. And on this day, there was an incident where a bunch of white CEGEP students put on blackface and were pulling a papier-mâché head of Jean Charest, and they changed his name to Jean Chab, something more English. It was like John Chabot or something like that. And one of the things to keep in mind in terms of why that's less fucked up than if it had happened in the US, for example, is because the Quebecois have a history of thinking of themselves as a colonized people, even though they are both the colonizers and the colonized in different contexts. So in the 1960s, there was a huge national liberation struggle in Quebec. There were armed struggle groups, much like there were in the US. The FLQ in particular was making tons of links between the Black Power movement in the States and their struggle in Quebec. There were a lot of people going back and forth across the borders, a lot of people talking to each other about different struggles in Quebec and ordering schools to reopen. So they started handing out injunctions to try and stop the picket lines. And all that ends up creating is the schools spending massive amounts of money on private security companies, and there being pretty intense confrontations between the riot cops and the picketers outside of their schools. So it brings a bit of the intensity to the doors of some of these universities. And a lot of them stay closed because people are still unable to, or don't want to cross the picket lines, and a lot of the teachers' unions end up not going to work in solidarity with the students, citing that fact that we will not cross the picket line. It's in our union policy. So people also were trying really creative things in terms of getting their schools to shut down. I heard rumors of people releasing a crowd of locusts into their school. There were people releasing crickets into their schools, just trying to find different creative ways to keep their schools closed, even though there were these court injunctions that were trying to force people to keep their schools open. So, I mean,
Any cockroaches?
Pardon, I didn't hear about any cockroaches now.
Cockroaches.
Appropriate.
So April 20th is a really important day for a lot of people who I know who weren't in school, but who were following the strike and trying to be involved. And there is an economic plan that the government of Quebec is trying to implement called Plan Nord, which is a really intensive resource extraction and energy getting policy that's supposed to take place in northern Quebec. So it's sending Hydro-Quebec, which is like the Quebec National Hydro Agency, into northern Quebec to build more dams, to try and extract more resources. And there's been a lot of resistance from Indigenous folks in that area who've been blockading highways and making calls for solidarity from people in the cities. So one of the reasons why this Plan North demo gets called is because Jean Charest is holding a job fair to invite people to come and apply for jobs up north. And instead of letting him have his job fair in peace, people show up at the Palais de Congrès, which is this big conference center in downtown Montreal, and try and stop him from being able to have his conference. And that was one of the first days where you see more anti-capitalist chants, more Indigenous solidarity chants than you see student chants, which is a bit of a shift in terms of rhetoric around the strike. And you also see, someone was telling me they saw black flags everywhere. There are a lot more people wearing masks, a lot more people being confrontational with the cops. And that was the first day you see riot cops turning and running from people because people are picking up pavement, picking up rocks in the street, and just pelting the cops with rocks so intensely that they turn and run.
Have there been any serious injuries, like besides losing his eye, any shootings or anything?
There haven't been any shootings, no one's died yet, but I'm going to get this around April 20th, things start speeding up really fast, and there are some really intense injuries that happen.
So for the length of the previous strikes hadn't been long enough to disrupt like a whole semester of quarter. I'm just wondering how that
So
plays
Quebec
out.
students have never lost a semester by going on strike. The government usually figures out a way to cram in all the courses they miss as soon as they agree to something, agree to go back to school. And even now, even though students have been on strike since February and are continuing to say that they'll be on strike, they haven't lost their semester.
So, okay, because maybe you're going to talk more about that, but I'm just wondering about the pressure of if someone's paying for college and they stand to lose some time.
Right.
You know, how
It's unprecedented so far. They haven't lost a semester going on strike yet. And I think a lot of people are still banking on the government wouldn't be able to absorb the amount of students that would need to recomplete their classes if they don't let these students finish the semester by giving them like a special semester and then starting the new semester late is one of the ways that they usually do it. But I'm going to talk about it in a bit. There's a law that gets enacted that has
So
an impact.
do you get all A's this semester?
I haven't been in school, but the people I know who have been in school have definitely been failing their classes. Because some of the schools, like at McGill, when you go on strike at McGill, the administration refuses to recognize the fact that you're on strike because it's never happened before. So people just aren't going to class, and then their professors are failing them, and it's become a whole thing in terms of a lot of people I know at the Anglophone universities just failing out of a lot of their
So you're
classes.
not in school anymore?
No, I haven't been in school.
So it's like a reverse grading curve in a way.
Yeah, in a way. So April 20th, things start speeding up really fast. The Plan Nord demo happens, the riot cops are actually running from people in the streets, and the next day, class calls off the meeting point. There was supposed to be a date, like a round 2, and the people I heard who had better politics were involved in class were saying things like, we were taking away the spotlight from Indigenous folks who come down from different towns up north to talk about what's going on in their communities. We made this about the student struggle. We need to step back and give those people space to talk about their struggles too. And while I think that's totally legit, what actually ended up happening is that the 400 people who showed up on day 2 instead of the thousands of people who showed up on day 1 all got kettled and all got arrested. So that was kind of a downside to class calling off the meeting point for day 2. One thing that has started happening at this point in the strike is that the media is pressuring class really hard to condemn the vandalism that's been happening, to condemn the violence that's happening at the demos, in order to be allowed to participate in the negotiations that the government is saying they'll start.
Pressure from the press on the police or the police on the press?
The press are saying things like, the government says class can't negotiate until they denounce the violence, and it's spreading a lot of ideas about what counts. I mean, the press spreads a lot of ideas about what counts as violence, so this is one of those incidences where they're saying violence is when people smash the windows in a government office when there's no one there versus when the cops shoot somebody in the eye. It's alleged, and we don't know what happened and all that kind of stuff. So class actually condemns the violence that weekend. They come out with a press release that's called Class Condemns the Violence, and then they retract it and put out another one that says class takes a stance on violence, and it ends up being more nuanced than the first one where they're saying, okay, actually we have a problem with it when there's violence against people in these demonstrations, but we don't have a problem with violence against property, and they sort of nuance their point a bit, but at that point the government has said they can participate in the negotiations, so they're sort of in the clear. And negotiations start, so the Minister of Education calls for a truce while the negotiations are on. She says, nobody go out into the streets while this is going on so that I can negotiate in good faith with the students. But what she doesn't really understand is that the people she's negotiating with, at least in classes, from classes' perspective, don't have any decision-making power. So they're just spokespeople. They're not able to tell the students at the grassroots level, you can't have a demo while this truce is going on. So the only way the truce gets out is in the media, and as soon as the word the truce comes out, as soon as that idea comes out, one of the CEGEPs who's involved in the strike calls a fuck the truce demo, and it happens the first night of negotiations, I believe. And that's when the night demos start. And the night demos become a really big thing. They continue all the way on from that point until now. I think we're hitting the 100th one really soon. And the levels of participation have fluctuated and gone up and down, up into the thousands and down into the, like, I think 40 at some point this summer. There, it got really small again. But anyways, that's when the night demos start. And then class gets kicked out of the negotiations based on how confrontational that first night demo is. The night demos continue to be confrontational for 2 or 3 nights, and by the end of the week, negotiations have broken down completely because FERC, in fact, walk out of negotiations in solidarity with class. Because they realize that if they don't, there will be a repeat of what happened in 2005, when they ended up negotiating with the government on their own. They lost a lot of support on the student union basis. A lot of people decided to not associate with their federation anymore and instead associate with the class. So they don't want that to happen again, so they walk out of the negotiations as well. Also around that time, Charest comes out with a deal for the students. He says, okay, look, I'll lower the tuition increases by $1, but we're going to spread them out over 7 years. And people essentially turn back to him and say, look, we can do the math. That ends up adding up to a higher hike than you were introducing before, so no thanks. Although that isn't an official thing, it's just something that he's putting out in the news. There were public service announcements going around with that deal in it, so a lot of people were hearing about it. So negotiations have broken down. People are pretty pissed off about that. And on May 1st, there is an annual anti-capitalist demonstration that happens. There used to be one big, huge union demo, and then the union demo started sending their own security to the demo to police what people do at the demo, so all the anti-capitalists decided to hold their own demo. And this year it was actually bigger than the union demo. There were thousands and thousands of people there, and the cops came down pretty hard on that demo. The cops attacked the demo within like 45 minutes to a half an hour and immediately tried to disperse everyone. There were lots of smoke bombs, there were lots of cops running for long blocks, like just chasing people for blocks and blocks and using paint guns to try and spray paint on people so that they can identify you after the demo if you still have the same pants on. So by that Friday, I think the student unions had gone back into negotiations with the Minister of Education, and that Friday was also a meeting of the Liberal Party, which is the party that represents Jean Charest. So his ministers and I think him were having this conference in a little small town outside of Montreal called Victoriaville. So the student unions all say, okay, we're going to bring the party to Victoriaville. They rented 5 or 6 buses and drove a couple thousand people to this small town where all there was to do was march from a Walmart to the place, the hotel, the only hotel in town where they're having this conference. And that time, oh, something I missed. Okay, so usually in Montreal, the way that things go is that there's the SPVM, which is the city cops, and then there's the SQ, which is the provincial cops. And on April 20th, at the big Pine North demo that I was talking about, where you see the cops running for people in the streets, they actually called in the SQ as backup. Because at this point, the Montreal cops are using a lot of overtime. They've tripled or quadrupled their budget since then.
Running out of gas.
Yeah, they're totally running out of gas. So they call in the provincial cops, and the provincial cops look totally different and aren't used to doing crowd control in the same way that the Montreal cops are. Like the Montreal cops have actually been condemned by the UN for the crowd control tactics that they use, but they haven't changed their style. They just like using mass arrests. So you have the SQ come in, they look like the army. It just totally changes the atmosphere of what's going on in the streets because people feel like they're confronting the army.
So they're like a National Guard?
Well, they're the provincial cops. Their uniforms just look kind of like army uniforms. They're green instead of black. They don't have the shields.
They carry different weapons?
I don't think they have different weapons. They still have rubber bullets. They still have the flashbang grenades, all that kind of stuff. So in Victoriaville, I could show a bit of it, but I don't know. It's kind of intense to watch. In Victoriaville, do it?
Yeah.
Okay, in Victoriaville, the cops are using, the SQ, the provincial police, are using tear gas, which they don't use in Montreal because it's too heavy and it floats down into the metro system, and then you've got everyone in the city inhaling tear gas instead of just the protesters. So the clouds that you see hanging in the air, you wouldn't see in a Montreal demo because it's tear gas, and in Montreal they use CS gas, which you can see for a little bit, but not that long. So there's some sort of inspiring thing that's happening, and just show that part. But what you're going to see, it's really hard to see. The van on the left there is an SQ van, And you're gonna see a like yellow jacketed person on the ground. That's a cop trying to arrest somebody, but all of his reinforcements have left him. So he's there on the ground trying to arrest this person, and you're gonna see a bunch of other people basically pull him off their friend to get their friend to get him. But this is Victoriaville people we're describing to be
Les images que vous voyez en ce moment ont provoqué énormément
That's
de
the cop on the
réactions.
ground.
Les événements
And
sont survenus à
his reinforcements just
Victoriaville
drove
en soirée.
away.
Ici, on voit ici un policier passer un mauvais moment aux mains des casseurs.
Another cop comes up and shoots a can of tear gas right at the cop who's on top of the protester. He gets up and you can see him walk away, and the person he was trying to arrest gets up and walks in the other direction. So there were some pretty interesting DRS tactics that people were learning at this point. You know, by the end of April, people have been in the streets together for 2 months. They've been learning a whole lot of different things together, and things like that become more possible for people to think of having happened.
So the one throwing the gas, is that another cop or?
Yeah. This person is not a cop, but the person who had the gun and was shooting off the the person who had the gun and was shooting off the tear gas was another cop. So people were describing Victoriaville to me as a war zone. And this is where we start getting the injuries that are so intense that it changes how people think about going into the streets. So one thing that happens in Victoriaville, someone gets shot in the side of the head with what I think was a rubber bullet, and the cops won't call 911. People are asking them to call 911. This kid ends up getting moved 3 or 4 times with a head injury when you really shouldn't be moving somebody. They end up in a coma for the weekend. People are talking as if this person might die. He's in intensive care all weekend. Someone else gets hit in the eye with either a flashbang grenade or a rubber bullet and loses sight in their eye. So those kinds of things keep happening. The kid who was in the coma ends up getting out. I think he's still in the hospital, but I'm not entirely sure, but things seem like he's gonna be okay. But one thing that changes after Victoriaville is that people have to start thinking about this. So like, if I go out to these demos, I could lose sight in an eye, I could end up in a coma. Like the cops are just using these weapons that they say are non-lethal, but not necessarily using them in the ways they're intended, or I don't know, I don't really want to speculate on why the cops hurt people in the streets. So one tactic that starts getting used after Victoriaville is that people start setting off smoke bombs in the metro. So the metro in Montreal is a really huge system. There's 4 different lines. People use it to get all over the place. And what people started doing, and they've been doing it since the beginning of the strike, but after Victoriaville, it becomes a concerted effort where on one day you have smoke bombs going off on all 4 different lines. And they essentially managed to shut down the metro system for 2 or 3 hours during rush hour when a lot of people are trying to get to work. It's like a pretty interesting way to try and disrupt the flows of the economy in Montreal so people can't get to work. So that happens. Those people start being portrayed in the media as terrorists, and on May 11th, they end up turning themselves in because a good citizen took photos of them, and the photos of them are all over the news, those suspects, and so those people turn themselves in, they're being called terrorists in the news, and this is where we start seeing the really intense conditions. So some of the conditions that people have been facing, the metro suspects, the smoke bomb people in particular, are facing conditions like they can't be within 300 meters of a metro, I think. They're not allowed to associate with anyone who has an open file with the police, which at this point is like thousands of people. Yeah. And you see other people, some people who got arrested at the end of March, who then get arrested again during the night demos, actually get banished from the island of Montreal. So they're told, you've been arrested once during this strike, you get arrested again. Okay, here's the deal. You can either sit in jail until your trial, which isn't going to be for another year, maybe 2, based on what we've seen with the G20 defendants just getting sentenced this year, some of them, or you can leave the island of Montreal, and you're not allowed on the island unless you're in court. So there's 3 people I know of who've been banished from the island of Montreal, even though they've lived there for a long time, they have apartments there, they have jobs there, they're going to school. They're not allowed on the island. So they're still trying to fight those conditions now. They haven't had that much success so far, but it's something that you wouldn't hear about in the news necessarily. So the next thing that happens is on May 14th, the Minister of Education quits. She's like, I'm done, I can't negotiate anymore. The Premier is not giving me enough leeway in terms of negotiating yet.
Just a quick question. You mentioned earlier that people weren't allowed to associate with anyone with an open file. So what would happen? You just get arrested?
Yeah, so what happens is I know people who have to carry their conditions on them. So when you get released from jail, you have these conditions that you have to sign, and they say you're not allowed to do this or this or this or this. And if the cops catch you doing it, they can throw you back in jail on something that's called violation of your conditions.
Okay.
And then if you get arrested on violation of your conditions, they usually give you a harder time getting out, so you have to pay more bail, you have to agree to even stricter conditions, and it just kind of snowballs.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wait, excuse me, wife and
So Lynn Beauchamp quits. The new person who gets appointed in her place is someone named Michelle Coches, and she used to be the education minister, but previous to this new appointment, she was the finance minister in Quebec. So some people saw that as a bit of a victory. Lynn Beauchamp, I think, was just like, I can't deal with these students anymore. But a lot of people understood that it was just changing faces in terms of who was in that position, and didn't mean that the premier was going to negotiate with anyone any more than he had before. So at this point, a lot of schools are still fighting the injunctions pretty intensely. There's still a lot of confrontations happening on the university campuses and the CEGEP campuses. And on May 18th, the second one might not have happened on May 18th, but around May 18th, 2 laws get passed that are pretty scary. One is an anti-mask bylaw that gets passed in Montreal, so as a city bylaw. And so that says you can't wear a mask at a demonstration. If you're caught wearing a mask at a demonstration, you won't just be charged with participating in an illegal demonstration, which is usually what you get, because at this point, as soon as demos are starting, the cops are declaring them illegal. You can also get charged with wearing a mask at a demonstration, which carries a higher fine than just participating in an illegal demonstration. And the other law that passes is the one that's gotten the most press. I think it's around this time that the student strike starts getting press in the US. It's called Law 78, and it basically says you can't have a demonstration with more than 50 people there without telling the cops the length of your demo and the route. And you have to tell them 12 hours, 8 to 12 hours before your demo, I believe. And another thing that Law 78 does is it ends the semester for the students, and it's basically a lockup. Like the students got locked out of their universities, so the picket lines stop. And then another thing it says is that you can no longer demonstrate within, you can't organize a demonstration within 100 meters of a school. And if you are a part of a student union and you're advocating a demonstration that happens in front of a school, or even advocating a strike, your union can face fines of up to $50,000, I believe. It's something really high like that. So a lot of people are really angry at Law 78. May 18th was also the weekend of the Anarchist Book Fair in Montreal, which is the biggest Anarchist Book Fair in North America. So you have tons of radicals concentrated in one city. So of course the immediate reaction to Law 78 getting passed is people becoming really confrontational in the streets. It's the first time we heard rumors of Molotov cocktails getting thrown at the cops, the first time in a long time. I think the last time, that was a really big thing that happened in Quebec in the 70s and 60s, but hasn't happened so much since. So the Friday night, Saturday night, and Sunday night demos are really confrontational. One other interesting thing that starts happening is that people realize that kettles can be broken. This is a thing that people start saying. So there were videos that were circulating on the internet. I didn't find this one before tonight, but it's a group of people who are being kettled in by cops on the north and on the south, and they realize that the number of cops on the north is not as many as it could be. And so they all start counting down, and they charge the cop line, and 100 or so people escape the kettle and continue on with their demonstration. So after May 18th, the night demos, those 3 night demos were really confrontational, and then thousands more people come out into the streets, and the demos come down a little bit. So there's thousands and thousands of people in the streets. That Tuesday is May 22nd, which would be the 3-month anniversary of the strike. At this point, it's the longest strike in Quebec history, so people are starting to realize the historical significance of what they're doing. 500,000 people are in the streets. And it's a Tuesday, so that's 500,000 people who aren't at work, who aren't in school. So other people have been explaining this to me as like the biggest unofficial general strike in Canadian history. It was also being described as the biggest civil disobedience, active civil disobedience in Canadian history, because class who organized the demo didn't give the cops their route. So you had 2 choices when you showed up at the demo. CSN, which is like a big union in Montreal, had also helped organize the demo, and they had given the route to the cops. So when you walked out of the main square where the demo was being held, you could choose to go right to the demo route that had been given to the cops, or go left with the class. And the majority of the people at the demo, like 400,000 people at the demo, 450,000 maybe, all chose to go left. So that's, the cops didn't even try and enforce Law 78 that day. They just were kind of like, oh my god, we're overwhelmed, and there's so many people in the streets, there's nothing we can do, they just let it go.
So the other unions, like the labor unions, it sounds like they were supportive, and yet it seems like Law 78 should have made them crazy.
Yeah, Law 78 also applies to them.
Right.
They realize that. Yeah.
And is that why the numbers just shot up?
I think that's
like
like
that would be quite a turning.
There was a call around that time for the strike to generalize. Students were asking for the strike to generalize, and a lot of artist-run centers were going on strike, and a bunch of women-run, like a bunch of NGOs were going on strike in solidarity with the students. But because of the way labor law works in Quebec, the unions couldn't go on strike with them. You can only go on strike when you're negotiating for your contract. And so they would have faced even higher fines if they had called for a strike than the student unions would. And I think they understood that. And also the union, the workers' unions in Montreal at least, have gotten way less radical over the years than the student strikes, the student unions have, because I think they face more repression for what they've done, and they've gotten older and decided, I don't know what's happened with them, but those unions were okay with giving their roots to the cops in a way that the student unions weren't. But there's still been a lot of solidarity in terms of workers being on strike during the student strike, and students showing up at their picket lines. There was a strike out at the airport in Montreal at one point, and the students showed up at the workers' picket lines, and then there were workers showing up at the students' picket lines. So there has been a lot of solidarity at the grassroots level, but not necessarily in terms of union execs asking their union to do anything. On the 23rd of May, at the night demo that night, there was the biggest kettle I've ever heard of happening in Montreal. So the cops managed to kettle in more than, I think it was 505 people all in one kettle, and gave them all participation in illegal assembly tickets, put them all on city buses, processed all of them. I had never seen that happen. It was really weird. And one other thing that happened at that time that was really exciting in terms of unions is that the bus drivers union says, we're not driving cops around anymore. So what you see in the lead up to these demos is the city buses full of ride cops driving from location to location trying to keep up with the demos, or driving and parking, and then they'll drive cop cars throughout the demo. So the bus drivers say we won't drive those around anymore, partly because it had gotten really unsafe for them to do so. Like if a demo accidentally came up upon an STM, but like a Transport Montreal bus full of cops, that bus might get attacked by the people in the demo. And the bus drivers are really realizing this and saying it's a safety issue, we don't want to do this anymore, but also Law 78 had gotten passed and they were really against it. So they say we're not going to drive these buses anymore. But at the end of the day, it doesn't change anything. The cops just train their people to drive the buses, and so you still see the city buses driving around cops. It's just not city bus drivers driving them around. So one cool thing that happens at this time is people talk about it as the time when the strike spreads. So people borrowed a tactic that had been used in Chile and started banging on pots and pans throughout the streets of Montreal. So one of the reasons why this happened is because the students had been locked out of their schools. They all go back to their neighborhoods and decide they want to do something in their neighborhoods. And someone who probably had connections to that movement in Chile decides that this would be a really good tactic to borrow. So this is a video that a lot of people maybe have seen, but anyways, it's just a really pretty video of the Casseroles happening in Montreal. And so the night demos become the Casseroles, and people are taking their pots and pans from their neighborhoods to the downtown demos and joining up.
Tu diras que c'est l'instinct qui t'a mené jusqu'ici. L'intuition, le sentiment ne revient. Tu diras que tous tes sens piochés amènent beau, même élan pour séparer force et tout.
So when people are walking around in these casseroles, you've got people banging their pots and pans off their porches at you. You've got people, there are a lot of support in the streets for these. A big slogan came out, which was "La grève étudiante, la cité populaire," which is it's a student strike, but it's a popular struggle. So people start talking in a more general way about it. These were happening all throughout the city after Law 78 got passed. So every night these would happen with this many many people in them for like 2 street. They were like thousands of people.
Tu diras que c'est l'instinct qui donne.
And how did the police respond to this?
There are no police in the video. There were hardly any police at the Casseroles. They had just completely backed off and sort of decided they're not going to apply this law. I know. So that sign says no to the special law. Law 78 was called the special law.
Everybody wear a mask?
Not anymore. There were thousands of people in this demo. There were tons of kids. I think people understood that masks have a role in other demos, but probably not these ones, so they stopped wearing them. And there were lots of other neighborhoods that started making their own banners. People were calling for different meetup points in their neighborhoods that could go from their neighborhoods to the big downtown demo, which you're seeing in this one. And then people started calling for neighborhood assemblies. So there were calls from a neighborhood called Rosemont Petit Battery. People passed out flyers that were like, we're against Law 78 and we support the student strike and we want this to generalize. Come to a neighborhood assembly and let's talk about how we can organize together as neighbors. And so that started happening all over the city. There are, I think, at this point, 18 different neighborhoods that have neighborhood assemblies that have been meeting either every 2 weeks or every week since the beginning of June. And they've been doing some pretty exciting things. One thing that happened in my neighborhood was that people got together and decided that they wanted to go. There was a call, let's get back up. There's a thing that happens in Montreal every year called the Grand Prix, which is like a big car race. And there's an island just off of Montreal that's really small that has this big, huge track on it where they have one of these F1 races. And they'll shut down 2 major streets in Montreal for a block, and they put up big stages, and they have these big, huge Grand Prix festivals where people, or like festival nights, where people will come to watch music during the weekend of the Grand Prix. So there was a call to disrupt the Grand Prix by the students who were like, we're on strike, we've been locked out of our schools, we're not going to keep going to the picket lines, let's disrupt the summer festival season in Montreal. Because there's festivals literally every single weekend of the entire summer in Montreal, and they're all outdoors, and they all involve blocking major streets to put up stages, to watch movies, to have music, all that kind of stuff. So my neighborhood decided to have a neighborhood contingent to go to one of these demos that was trying to disrupt the Grand Prix. So people had a sign that said, I live in St. Henry, it said St. Henry disobeys. There were like 50 or 60 so people from my neighborhood who marched over in a little march to join this bigger, like 1,000-person demo that ended up getting kettled for a while, and then they let everyone go. But it was just one of those things where you see neighborhoods figuring out a way to try and disrupt things on their own terms. And as soon as we left our neighborhood and took the streets, there was one cop car behind us going, your demo has been declared illegal, this is a notice, your demo has been declared illegal, but there were no cops around, so they weren't going to arrest any of us.
Go home and behave yourself.
Yeah. On June 13th, there was a railway line that was sabotaged in Farmland, Quebec. That was around the time when there was an International Economic Forum of the Americas happening in Montreal. There were big demos to disrupt the International Economic Forum, but nothing too intense happened. I think people were still bringing their casseroles to those demos. It's like a big thing that people have started doing at every demo now, is bringing a pot pan because they've realized how much noise it can make. And so since halfway through June or so, the demos have quieted down a lot. There's still nightly demos happening in Montreal at least, but they're really small. They always start from the same square, so it's really easy to find them, and they always start at 8:30 at night. But they've gone down to like 40 or so people sometimes, although I heard that the 78th one that happened had a couple thousand people at it. The strike has totally changed people's perception of how many people it takes to have a big demo versus a small demo. So my numbers are all up when I'm talking about like, oh, that was a really big demo. It's like there were 100,000 people there, and a really small demo was like a couple hundred. And so in terms of where we're at now, the CEGEPs are ordered back to school starting on August 13th. So there's, I think, 13 or 14 CEGEPs that are still on strike, or if they aren't officially still on strike, they'll be having a general assembly between now and August 13th to vote to go back on strike. And and their doors of their schools are supposed to open August 13th. This will be the first time people are in school with Law 78 in effect. People have been challenging Law 78 in the courts, but it hasn't gone anywhere yet, so for now, we're probably going to see some pretty intense confrontations between the cops and the CEGEP students. And there's been a call for convergence in Montreal the week of August 13th to the 17th, because the CEGEPs are all going back to school in waves, so 4 will start one day, 4 the next day, 3 the next day, 5 the next day until the end of the week. And the idea is to get a bunch of people into Montreal who haven't been on the picket lines for the last 4 months, who aren't super tired and burnt out, to try and reinforce that energy around the student strike, to keep the student strike going, but also because there are unions that are talking about going on strike. And they can't legally because of the way that labor law works in Quebec, but a lot of grassroots folks, especially in the hospitals, have been talking about going on strike against a lot of the austerity measures that the Quebec government has been putting in place for the last 10 years or so. One of the big ones is that they're trying to impose a user fee on the healthcare system there, which is a public healthcare system, which you used to not have to pay anything for, and now they're trying to impose more and more user fees on that system. And the people who work in the hospitals are saying, this is messed up, we don't want to see this happen, let's have a wildcat strike and see what happens. But so far they haven't been able to do it because their union leadership has been sort of messing around with the way that they can make those decisions, but that's something that also could happen in the next few months in Montreal. The universities are all scheduled to start school, and they're going to start picket lines again at the end of August, and so those start August 27th, I think, or August 28th. So that's sort of where we're at now. There's been a lot of talk also about an election happening in Quebec. The premier might call for an election as early as August 1st, and then the election would happen at the beginning of September. And so I don't know what will happen with that. There's a lot of different people who have a lot of different predictions around what would happen if the Liberals ended up not in power. Who would the other people be? One of the parties that has historically had a lot of weight in Quebec is the Parti Québécois, which is the separatist party. They have also been supportive of the student movement when it suits them and not supportive when it doesn't suit them. So people are sort of unclear about what they would do if they came into power. There's also some interesting left-wing parties, among them Quebec Solidaire, which is pretty cool, but also one of those tiny parties that probably wouldn't get a lot of votes in the election. Yeah?
Previous elections, have they carried a significant percentage of the vote?
I'm not sure. I don't think the last one did. I think it was probably somewhere between 60 and 70%, but I'm not sure. In terms
16 or 17?
In terms of the percentage of the population that voted.
Right.
Yeah.
That's not bad.
So that's what's been happening.
And the faculty at the schools?
So the faculty of the CEGEPs, their union is talking about going on strike starting August 13th to stop school from open again, or how radical their leadership is in terms of actually calling a strike and seeing that happen. But if they went on strike, I think it would be illegal because they're not negotiating a contract right now.
So do the faculty and students are pretty much on the same page as?
At the Francophone schools, a lot of the faculty won't cross the picket lines. So when they set up picket lines, as soon as they decide that they're on strike, the faculty stays home in solidarity with the students, because a lot of them, I think, in their union mandates say they won't cross the picket line. And at the Anglophone schools, they were having class anyways. The administration just refused to recognize that the Anglophone schools were on strike. So a lot of the students are just failing their classes or trying to negotiate with their teachers directly about how to make up assignments that they missed.
Are the teachers sympathetic?
Depends on the class, depends on the faculty. Yeah. I've heard in the fine arts faculty at Concordia, the teachers were sympathetic and weren't holding class on campus, but they would hold class in a cafe off campus. But then a lot of the teachers that I heard of, and the cooler teachers ended up saying to their classes, like, look, you guys are organizing, I'm going to give you all A's for organizing, and we'll just see what happens. But I haven't heard too many teachers doing that.
Do you think the students are going to start to feel, I guess they would start to feel like economic pressure, like you got to get through college, I got to get out there to work, times are tough as it is, and it seems like that would really change the tenor of it.
I mean, especially in the summertime when people were saying, oh my God, I can't get a summer job because I'm still on strike and I don't know if the semester's going to start again or what's going to happen. So a lot of people were having a hard time with that, trying to figure out whether or not to stay on strike. But they also understand that they're inheriting the legacy of people who've been fighting really hard to not see their tuition rise.
And I guess that's the other thing that seems so different is that level of non-self-interest is just stunning to me. It's really surprising and pretty wonderful.
Yeah, I think it would be hard to see that happen.
Yeah.
Is the class supportive of any of the parties in the election?
So the only thing I've heard class saying is they're against the Liberals. So they picked ridings where they know the Liberals don't have a huge majority, and they've been going door to door in those ridings saying, don't vote for the Liberals, vote for anyone but the Liberals, because we don't want to see them in power for the rest of their time. Yeah?
Canada Constitution.
They have a charter.
A charter. Now, do these new laws, like not wearing a mask and number 8, violate the charter?
I don't know, because I don't know much about Canadian law, but I do know that the federal government, there's currently a conservative party that's in power in Canada, and the federal government is trying to pass a law that says it's illegal to wear a mask in a demo, and they're trying to make it criminal, and could hold up to like a 5-year sentence in jail.
Yeah, I know, but does that violate the charter? I mean, because like that would violate our constitution.
Yeah.
No, there's actually a mask law in New York. In Occupy Wall Street, lots of people were arrested for wearing masks.
And you
That
know,
law.
yeah, we were just in Rochester, and somebody brought a big bag of masks, and they did arrest people who were wearing masks. But technically, that is freedom of speech.
Right, but there's an ancient law that they basically pulled out of judges that say it's not
Really?
like 2 or more people can't be masked in public. Like out in the street, like if you were inside in a bar or something like that. So, but it's an excuse, you know, to arrest people.
There's also a law
I don't know.
in Wisconsin that says you can't use relish on a hot dog on Sundays. Yeah.
I mean, they can throw up laws, but there is freedom of speech. They ought to be able to throw that out in
I
court.
think people have been challenging a lot of these laws in courts. I don't think they're challenging the mask law right now in Montreal, but they are challenging Law 78. And the Quebec Human Rights Commission recently came out and said that Law 78 violates the charter, so
Were many people arrested for the mask law?
I think a couple of people have so far. But the only thing, you don't hear of people who get arrested and held for a long time with the mask bylaw in Montreal, you just hear of people getting $5,000 tickets for participating in the demonstration. But there's a campaign I mean, it would be a class action lawsuit here. There's a campaign to collectivize all of the people who've been getting tickets as a result of all of these demonstrations to try and challenge those tickets. And what happens with the anti-police brutality demo is that people challenge the tickets, and then 4 years later the court rules that your arrest was unconstitutional or whatever, and you only have to pay like a third of your ticket or something like that. But it takes years and years, and you have to like sit through the court process to do it.
You might have went through this already, but what are some things that like constitute it differently that allow it to be so popular today?
So I was talking a little bit about the history of the student movement. One reason is because these unions are based on the combative unionism of the French student unions that came up in 1968. And so they have general assemblies where they make decisions at a faculty level, and then they choose to associate with a federation that'll negotiate with the government for them, but at the same time, they don't get to make the decision about who agrees to the negotiation. So the government will give them a deal and say, here's your deal, and then they have to take it back to their general assemblies and make decisions there. So it also sets up a structure where there is this like collective decision making happening in the schools. People are deciding to go on strike because of whatever's happening around them, and that really gives it like a huge collective feeling that wouldn't exist here, I don't think, because student unions here are organized so differently than they are there. So I think that helps a lot. It's also like people who are my age in Quebec maybe had parents who were involved in national liberation struggles during the 1960s, or were at least sympathetic. In October 1970, in Montreal, or in Quebec in general, they declared the War Measures Act because the FLQ had kidnapped 2 people. And so the army occupied the streets of Montreal, and they arrested anyone who was involved with political organizing that they could get their hands on. They threw a ton of people in jail. And so a lot of people's parents remember that. A lot of people's parents were probably involved in student organizing, so it does become a bit of a like cultural thing that you do that doesn't seem as weird as it does here.
Which is funny because, I mean, there's actually a huge history here too. I mean, everything from like Penn State to like the Weathermen to the ASA and everything else. So it's kind of just got separated. And whereas it sounds like in Quebec they were consistent, and our consistency here broke.
Yeah.
It just hasn't been reestablished.
And I think part of it is also that the state didn't crack down as hard.
Yeah.
So you see people getting life sentences. There is no death penalty in Quebec. You see people getting life sentences, but even when you get a life sentence for involvement in an armed struggle group, you're still going to get out of prison after like 10 years.
I think the U.S. is a bit harsher. Like I was in Chicago, the NATO protest, and a couple of my friends from the city were there. They got like invaded. They busted in one of their apartments. They black bagged them, held them in solitary confinement for 48 hours, and all they were doing was planning march routes.
Yeah. And there have been houses that have been raided in Montreal?
They were planning marching routes. marching bands.
Oh.
Yeah, but they, I mean, there was a whole pretense. They said they were planting bombs or figuring out who to bomb, and I mean, they confiscated all their computers and I mean their routes. That's it, and like notes, you know what I mean?
Yes, there is further history.
But like, it's really intimidating.
Yeah, in Buffalo, I think it happened in the mid-1960s when a person in a bookstore on the east side of Houston, Martin South Street, was set up and shut down and was sent off for what, 20, 30 years. And Governor Gary gave them a compensation. Because he was going out of office, I think around 1979 or 80. So they made him do 90 years. There's also the Buffalo Nine, I think, with the group of resistors here, with helping people organize to get the Canada and functions and chapters. So there's that history of the 60s down in Buffalo too. But I don't know, there is a difference, you know? The only time I saw thousands in the streets was when one of those hockey finals and the puppy said, no, that was gonna go, and Buffalo went crazy.
Montreal goes pretty intense.
This place priorities.
People there.
Yeah.
I mean, there's been thousands in the street in New York City, especially in the first couple of months there, you know, on the Brooklyn Bridge, there were like 700 arrests, but I mean, like, it's like kind of cleared out, like, since, you know, I mean, it's like, not even 40, and it's, you know what I mean?
You're talking about Mohawk, Wall Street?
Yeah.
Wait, the question I was wondering, like, when organizing the students, like, imagine there was huge resistance from students who like managed to read the books or they saw the like these strikes as disruptions. Like, how did that? And also, like, what kind of percentage of students were maybe like not even were even against the strikes? I was just like curious about how they had to deal with that.
I mean, there were students at every single school filing injunctions saying they want to go back to class. But I think partly because of the history of strikes, maybe partly because of the General Assembly, so people feeling like they do have an outlet to say that, to say I don't want to be on strike anymore. And there are the conversations that happen in the lead up to strikes where people are arguing with each other about why do we go on strike, what's this tactic about, what are we doing, you know, does this even matter?
Oh, okay. How long does it go about discussions?
I think since people failed to have a general strike happen in 2007, they've been talking to people about having a strike.
It's kind of like majority rule when it comes down to it.
Yeah, it is. In the like general assemblies, it is, I think, a majority vote kind of situation. But then it's sort of like people respecting the choice of their classmates to go on strike and being like, I'm not going to cross the picket line to go to school. So if I don't really support it, if I don't really care, I just won't go. Like, I won't go to school, but I won't go to the picket lines either. And I think a lot of people do that. But then when things get really intense and like the student unions get kicked out of negotiations and they realize that, you know, we've tried everything else, what else is there? Then thousands of people do show up in the streets and they're like, oh, I thought this wasn't a big deal, but now I do think it is.
Okay.
So I think that's when it's changed throughout the course of the strike too.
Are you gonna start organizing here in Buffalo now?
I don't live here. I just got permanent residency
I
up
think you're
there.
from Buffalo.
I am. I grew up here and I moved to Montreal when I was 18 and then I've been there ever since.
You're going back.
No, I'm not coming back.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
So come to Buffalo and organize.
I know.
You use it, right?
Whereabouts did you grow up? Where were you born? What area?
I was born on Ashland Avenue near Summer, not that far from here. Or I was born in Albany, I lived there for 2 years, and then I grew up on Ashland near Summer.
We were just down in Washington a few weeks ago, and the first night, we were out in front of the Bank of America. There was about 40, 45 people with, you know, sleeping bags and everything, guitars. And one of the young men came over with a $50 parking ticket that he wrote out himself, and he served it on a cop who was parked on the sidewalk. Right the first he said, you think that's a good? He says, you think that's good? I said, well, I said, you're pushing the envelope a little. That's it. You know,
Great,
he was over there with a couple of guys, and the cop was laughing.
Yeah.
You know, he was laughing. But,
It seems as though, like, from ancient times, like, ethnic homogeny and national identity and things like that are the cohesive things that keep people together. So I understand why a francophone world, you know, is kind of like tight-knit and it could produce this kind of solidarity, but then you put blackface on it. So I'm just wondering, like, how to address the racial and class component.
Yeah, I think that was huge during the FLQ too, of like people only seeing themselves as colonized and not thinking about the indigenous folks who lived in the province before they even got there and called it a province. Like there has been, I don't know how much, I know there have been a lot of people who are francophone, who are from Quebec, who've been trying to do that work, and I know it's been hard over the years, but I don't know too much about like specific groups that existed to combat that racism in Quebec. I know a lot of people who do it now and who do Indigenous solidarity in Quebec and talk about it as being a really important thing, but a lot of the people I know in the city are Anglophones and didn't necessarily grow up there. And while I'm meeting more and more Francophone people, they are all like think politically in a similar way that I do, so I don't really know what arguments people are making to their parents or like to their cousins about what this looks like in terms of being in solidarity with Indigenous people, thinking about racism in different ways.
Were any of the students who were arrested drawn into the prison movement or criminal justice?
Yeah, there was a really cool, so a big thing that people do in Montreal, or have been trying to do over the last few years, is hold noise demos outside of the prisons, which are all in the suburbs, so you have to take the bus out to the suburbs and then have this little demo outside of these prisons, and people will set off fireworks and yell and stuff. And the biggest one I've ever seen happen in Montreal happened right after some of the smoke bomb, the Metro smoke bomb people got arrested and were in jail, and they started making links with people inside, people outside were setting off fireworks, and then they started, in the women's prison at least, in the provincial women's prison, people all went out into the yard and started communicating with protesters across the fence, and that was kind of cool until the cops shut it down. But I do think a lot of people are realizing, like, we have to think about prison, we have to, like, be more involved in prisoner solidarity.
There's a local group that stands in front of the holding center. There's been like 18 suicides, alleged suicides in the last 10 years. It's been 3 years now. This month alone, it's been 3 years.
One big thing that's happening up there too is August 10th is Prisoner Justice Day in Canada, which is a day that people inside started to recognize other people who died inside. So they have like a huge list of names that gets passed around the country through all the jails every year on August 10th to commemorate all those people. And then a lot of people inside refuse to work and do a day-long hunger strike kind of thing. So one of the things my neighborhood's been doing is organizing a big, huge street festival kind of thing on August 10th in the lead up to the students going back to school, but also recognizing that it's Prisoner Justice Day and trying to invite a bunch of folks who are either on parole if they can come if they want to, or people who do prisoner justice organizing in Montreal to come and give workshops about the prison system and about the way the prison system has been changing because the Conservative government's been changing a lot of things in the last few years.
Do you have a political prisoner support group or something like that?
Yeah, the political prisoner calendar that comes out, I think, is put together by people in Montreal.
Do they criminalize things like prostitution and drugs and?
Yeah, sex work is illegal, except for in this one block in Montreal where it's semi-legal. And they're trying to pass a lot of mandatory minimum sentencing laws right now, or the federal government just passed a bunch of mandatory minimum sentencing laws that make the drug laws in Canada much more similar to the drug laws here than they used to be. So there's a lot of. I know. I don't know how the federal government thinks they're going to A, afford it, or B, why it would make any sense. It hasn't worked at all here.
Oh, we're number one in prisons.
Yeah.
Yeah, 3 years for us.
I mean, federal prison officials in Canada have been coming to visit the really intense, high security prisons in the U.S. in order to bring those inmates back to Canada. So those kinds of things are spreading there. There's like a huge prison expansion project underway. The construction is reaching like $2 billion. They're building 22 new prisons across the country and expanding.
Our for-profit prison system.
I don't think so. Quebec is like completely different from the rest of Canada.
Yeah.
Like in the federal elections, the rest of the country voted for the Conservative Party, and Quebec all voted for this left-wing party that you can have in terms of political parties in Canada. And they were the only province that was like majority New Democratic Party, and then the rest of the country was like majority Conservatives. And it was like, what is going on? Yeah.
I was just curious of how was like a lot of this protesting by other Canadians, and also like, and one question I like had these kind of conversations about was going on in Quebec with like friends here, and like the thing is like when they hear the price amount like of the just increase, they're like, come on, we pay like so much more. And I was wondering like how would you answer that to folks like?
One of the things, the conversations in the rest of Canada haven't happened the way you're talking about your friends doing it. So in other provinces in Canada, it already costs upwards of like $4,500 a year to go to school. Some places even more. But most of the universities in Canada are public. There's like a few private ones, but the majority are not private, they're public. So there has been a way to keep the tuition down in a way that there hasn't been here, just because the private universities here, I think, are just able to raise tuition as much as they want, and there's no way to stop them. But one of the things that I've heard a lot of people say is university tuition should be free. This is the class, the like big huge student federation that represents most of the unions that are on strike now. They're actually saying tuition should be free, and here's how you can do it. Like they have a whole financial plan for the province in terms of how to make university tuition free. Everyone should have access to this. Making it really cheap makes it easier for a lot more people to go to school. And the reason why our tuition is so cheap is because our parents were going on strike before us to stop the fee increases that are happening, and we're shutting down the province while they were on strike to stop those tuition increases. So a lot of the best argument I've heard is like they have a low tuition because they fought for it years and years and years.
You're too young to make a rate.
Yeah.
There's a lot of somewhere else that we can pay over there.
Yeah, for sure.
And also, I was just curious about class, like, anything I've read about online is like, just about the collectivized, like, making them like unwrap. Was there any particular politics with them? Or?
They're an explicitly feminist organization, and
Who?
the class, which is like the big student federation that represents most of the unions that are on strike right now. I think they have like an explicitly feminist mandate, and also they've just adopted an anti-racist mandate, as far as I know. I don't know what that means for the org. I think that's happened in like the last few months. And beyond that, I'm not sure. I mean, the feminism that they come up with is a little bit different than what I want to see them do, but...
Are there any males in the group?
Yeah, I mean, one of the weird things that's been happening with class is that the main person getting all the press is this guy named Gabriel Nadeau-Dubois. He's probably the person you've seen in the news, yeah. He's the spokesperson for class, along with someone who identifies as a woman. So she hasn't been getting the press all that much. He's been getting a lot of the media.
Even from like Democracy Now, like
Yeah.
a lot like Mother Jones and stuff, that Gabrielle's been getting a lot
I
more
know.
press.
And he's just the spokesperson, so other people have been annoyed at things he's been saying in the news because it sounds like he's making decisions for the whole org, and he's not. He's super clear in some articles I've read where he's like, I don't make decisions for this org, we're not hierarchical, or for this union, we're not hierarchical. I can only say what the student unions have told me to say, I can't say anything beyond that, but
How big is the class?
I forget. But they're representing the majority of the unions that are on strike. I mean, a couple of thousand students that are affiliated with the class through their faculty level unions at school.
Awesome.
Well, thank you all for coming, and thank you, Nate, for organizing this whole.
Thank you.
Start.